I want to start with a very simple point. Power is not just about aircraft carriers, sanctions, or angry speeches at a podium. Power is also about credibility. And credibility is a strange thing. It takes years to build, but sometimes it can start cracking in a single afternoon with a few badly sequenced statements. That is what I think many people are missing in this latest Trump episode around the Strait of Hormuz. At first, Trump wanted to sound like a conqueror. Iran, he implied, had been beaten, finished, reduced, decimated. That was the performance. Then came the second layer. Countries that rely on the Strait of Hormuz, he said, should take care of the passage, with the United States helping a lot. Now pause there. That is not the language of total control. That is not the voice of a system that knows exactly what it is doing. That is the voice of a political actor discovering, in real time, that theatrical dominance and actual strategic leverage are not the same thing. And the Strait of Hormuz is not some symbolic patch of water that only matters to naval analysts and foreign policy obsessives. It is one of the arteries of the global system. Oil moves through it. Shipping moves through it. Insurance pricing responds to it. Inflation responds to it. Airline costs respond to it. Freight responds to it. Your energy bill responds to it. Your groceries respond to it. Industrial planning responds to it. When that artery tightens, pressure does not stay in the Gulf. It moves outward through the whole machine. That is why I think the real story here is larger than Trump, larger than Iran, and even larger than the Strait itself. The deeper story is this. What happens when a country that still possesses enormous hard power begins to lose the hidden currency that makes hard power work smoothly? That hidden currency is trust. And Trump has been burning through it for months, if you want to understand why his messaging suddenly sounded unstable. You have to go back before this specific crisis. This did not begin with one statement about coalition naval support. It began with a pattern. For months he attacked allies, belittled partners, treated NATO as if it were some kind of protection racket, and behaved as though cooperation could always be extracted on demand after dignity had already been stripped away in public. That is not how serious alliances work. A serious alliance is not a reality show contract. It is a slow-moving political asset built from repetition, predictability, legal language, military coordination, bureaucratic memory, and trust under pressure. Trump keeps acting as if America is so large that the old machine will keep operating no matter how recklessly he treats the people inside it. That is the miscalculation, because while he was performing strength, other capitals were doing something much more important. They were studying exposure. They were asking hard technical questions. If Washington becomes erratic, what is our legal room for maneuver? If the United States improvises a conflict, what insurance arrangements do we need? If energy routes become unstable, what is our redundancy plan? If the White House treats allies as disposable tools, how quickly can we create side channels and fallback options? That is what serious states do. They do not wait for a crisis to become ideological theater. They start sketching backup architecture. Europe has been learning to hedge. The Gulf states have been learning to hedge. Even the media environment has been learning to hedge. And this is why Trump's sequence of statements mattered so much. If you really have the situation under control, you do not move from triumphalism to public burden, sharing requests in the same breath. You do not first suggest that the enemy has already been neutralized, and then imply that other countries now need to shoulder the task of protecting the passage. That is not smooth statecraft. That is message whiplash. And message whiplash at the center of a security system produces a very specific effect. Adversaries hear fragility. Allies hear thin planning. Markets hear rising risk. Trump's defenders will say this was just a call for fair coalition participation. But burden, sharing only works when the burden was discussed before the fire started. It does not work when the crisis is already live. And the same man now asking for help has spent months insulting the very governments he needs. That is the first receipt. He bragged first and outsourced second. He wanted the headline of dominance without the burden of owning the aftermath. And once you see that, the second receipt becomes much easier to understand. The pushback from allies and regional actors was not random. It was a signal. One revealing example came when suggestions started circulating that foreign partners, including France, would join a more assertive naval effort around the Strait of Hormuz. The French response was cold, technical, and revealing. No such shift, defensive posture, Eastern Mediterranean. Not what you are implying. Now, in plain language, that means something very simple. Number not our mission, not on your timetable, not under your improvised framing. And what makes that so important is that allied governments usually try very hard to avoid embarrassing each other in public during a live crisis. If they are moving quickly to cool expectations on the record, that means they do not trust the drift of the situation. That means they want it clear, for legal and political reasons, that they are not automatically attached to whatever Washington is hinting at. This is where Trump's theory of power runs into the actual mechanics of international systems. He keeps thinking Allied support is a kind of emotional reflex. He thinks humiliation and dependence can coexist forever. Insult them today, requisition them tomorrow. But countries remember, governments remember, defense ministries remember. They remember tariffs. They remember threats. They remember public contempt disguised as negotiation. So when a call comes in during a live crisis, the response is no longer automatic alignment. It is hedging, it is caution, it is posture without enthusiasm. The Gulf states are watching this too, and they are asking a very brutal question. Is the United States still a security guarantor, or is it becoming a destabilizing variable that requires insurance against? That is an extraordinarily dangerous question for any superpower to trigger in the minds of its own partners. Because dependence is not the same as trust, and trust is not the same as obedience. You can be militarily indispensable in some ways and still be strategically exhausting to everyone around you. That is where Trump has pushed the system. Now let me move to the third receipt, because this is where the picture becomes even more revealing. As the story got messier, Trump did what he often does when reality stops matching the performance. He attacked the coverage. He complained that the media was distorting the situation. He tried to shift the focus from contradictions in his own messaging to the alleged disloyalty of the people describing those contradictions. This is important, because when an administration is genuinely secure, it does not need to threaten the camera. It does not need to frame scrutiny as sabotage. It does not need to imply that broadcasters, journalists, or independent media should fear regulatory pressure for refusing to read from the approved script. But that is the instinct here: control the messenger when the narrative slips. Dress it up in the language of public interest, accuracy, national responsibility. Whatever phrase sounds respectable enough. But the core meaning is simpler. Tell the story our way, or understand that political power can be brought uncomfortably close to your door. That is not confidence. That is control anxiety. And here is the irony Trump world still refuses to understand. When people stop trusting official performance, they do not stop looking for information. They migrate, they look elsewhere. They move toward independent media, fragmented networks, specialized analysts, smaller platforms, anyone who seems willing to connect the dots honestly. That is one of the great blind spots in modern strongman politics. You can intimidate institutions. You cannot erase curiosity. And once the public begins sensing that official messaging is unstable, every attempt to pressure the messenger only confirms the instability. So if you step back now, you can see the whole pattern. Trump's model of power is still based on a crude 20th century intuition. Loudness equals strength, humiliation equals leverage, shock equals dominance, improvisation equals authenticity. But the modern system does not really reward that style the way he thinks it does. Because modern power is not just military inventory, it is trust networks, it is legal architecture, it is financial confidence. It is insurance assumptions. It is bureaucratic memory. It is the belief, shared across dozens of capitals and institutions, that when the center speaks, the center has already thought 3 moves ahead. Trump keeps damaging that belief, and once that belief weakens, the system starts building bypasses. That is the strategist move in this story, not some grand heroic speech, not a dramatic naval flourish, not televised outrage, distance, ambiguity, redundancy, limited exposure, quiet institutional self-protection. European governments reducing military attachment. Gulf states exploring de-escalation and diversification. Companies studying shipping risk. Insurers recalculating exposure. Media ecosystems building outside old gatekeepers. This is what a mature system does when the supposed anchor becomes volatile. It does not always revolt openly. It builds around the problem. And that is why this story matters so much for ordinary people, not just for diplomats and security analysts. If you live anywhere touched by energy prices, you are already inside this story. Shipping disruptions raise insurance premiums. Insurance premiums feed into freight costs. Freight costs move into retail, manufacturing, aviation, agriculture, and household budgets. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes a more unstable risk variable, payroll decisions get affected, pricing decisions get affected, investment timing gets affected. And here is what many people underestimate. Once a company changes routes, diversifies sourcing, shifts insurers, or rewires supplier relationships because a political partner appears unstable, those choices do not automatically reverse when the news cycle cools. The contracts follow the new routes. The capital follows the new routes. The jobs often follow the new routes. That is how structural change happens. Quietly at first, then all at once in hindsight. So where does this go? I think there are three broad scenarios. The first is a managed reset. Back channels open. Everyone finds face, saving language. Shipping stabilizes enough for markets to calm down. Trump says he forced burden sharing. Allies say they preserve stability. The headlines cool. But even in this best-case version, something important does not snap back. The memory remains. Partners have now seen the fragility in the sequence. They do not forget that. The second scenario is what I would call domino realignment. This is where middle powers keep learning from each other. Hedge more. Diversify more. Build regional arrangements. Strengthen alternatives in energy, finance, diplomacy, and media. In that world, the United States is still enormous, still powerful, still militarily central in many respects. But it is no longer the unquestioned axis around which every other player automatically turns. The center remains large, but it stops being absolute. This, in my view, is the most important scenario to watch because it is the one that can happen without dramatic spectacle. No giant collapse, no single iconic moment. Just repeated lessons teaching every actor in the network to trust the old architecture a little less each time. Then there is the third scenario, the spiral: more threats, more pressure on allies, more improvisation around security, more attacks on media, more market fear, more forced decisions by governments that do not actually want to choose sides on Trump's terms. This is how fragmentation deepens, not in one explosion, in shocks, repeated shocks, each one teaching the system the same lesson. Do not place all your strategic eggs in one basket. That is the final frame I want to leave you with. Trump did not invent every pressure point in the Middle East, but he is exceptionally talented at taking unstable systems and making them more volatile. And the countries now hedging against Washington did not create this whole story either. They are simply getting much better at surviving it. So the real question is not whether America still has hard power. Of course it does. The real question is whether Trump's method is preserving the architecture around that power or hollowing it out from the inside. And I think the answer is becoming harder and harder to avoid. He keeps trying to use power like a blunt instrument. The rest of the world is learning to respond like engineers, build distance, build redundancy, build alternatives. That is how systems survive a center they no longer fully trust.